Hello, my name is Tony. Stupidly, for years, decades even, and with no real basis, I convinced myself The Creep in Flesh was an Amicus film. Amicus was a production company established at Shepperton Studios by Max J. Rosenberg and Milton Subotsky. Their general brief was to produce horror films in direct competition with Hammer Studios, only their product had more of an emphasis on portmanteau or anthology movies, which told multiple stories linked by an overarching narrative structure. So, for instance, in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, you've got 5 guys in a train compartment, each with a story to tell. Asylum sees a new doctor interviewing patients in a mental health facility. Torture Garden, you get 5 people visiting a fairground sideshow, and so on. They hacked out standard fare also. 2 Doctor Who movies with Peter Cushing in the 60s, The Skull, The Psychopath, Scream and Scream Again, and many others. But The Creep in Flesh wasn't one of them. I saw it on a double bill with And Now the Screaming Starts around 73-74, and that was an Amicus picture. So I must have just assumed the same of the former, and I was wrong. And I've been wrong for decades, until watching it again on a not particularly inspiring Blu Ray remaster put me right, by informing it was made by a company called World Film Services, whoever the fuck they were, and joint distributed by Tony Tenser's Tygon Productions and Columbia Pictures. It's pissed me off, to be honest. I'm not sure why exactly, but it has. I know the only person at fault here is me, but still. On the creative side, The Creep in Flesh employs several of the usual suspects who'd done a lot of work for Hammer and Amicus over the years. It's directed by stand-up regular Freddie Francis, who replaced Don Sharp at the last minute. Stars Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, as well as Hammer stock support guy Michael Ripper turning up as a coach driver. Cinematographer is Norman Warwick, who lensed Hammer's Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde and would go on to be director of photography on the Hammer House of Horror TV series. And Roy Ashton oversaw special makeup effects. It's near impossible to count how many productions he was involved with for Hammer, Amicus and others. Absurd as it is, The Creep in Flesh manages to be an interesting and imaginative horror fable, and one that, intentionally or not, pitches itself into a mild critique of the Victorian patriarchy, whilst casually tossing in some low-key anti-misogyny missives along the way. There's a main monster of the inhuman type and a couple of the more recognisable sort. Despite most of the dialogue being pseudo-scientific bunk and junk, the script delivers some pure acid here and there, mostly courtesy of Mr. Lee, and the overall desolate and doomy tone of the piece, an apocalypse of evil in the offing, does provide a bit of an alternative to the usual horror fantasy staples. This is what it's about. The film opens on Professor Emmanuel Hildern, Peter Cushing, in what seems to be a Victorian laboratory. He's painting a garish canvas of some hellish flesh-eating fiend. Not a life portrait, thankfully. A young medic, David Bailey, has arrived to meet with him. Hildern, or Manny as I will refer to him with familiarity throughout, declares that he needs help with his research. He speaks of having identified the essence of pure evil and describes it as a contagion, a pathogen, a disease that once set loose on the world threatens the very existence of mankind. There's something a bit off about Manny's lab. It's like a bright white void with some sparse equipment and minimalist furniture dotted around, and oil paints. It just doesn't look right. However, to convince the young quack of the validity of his theories, Manny tells him his story. Manny is an anthropologist who 3 years earlier returned home to his English country manor from an expedition to New Guinea. He's greeted by his prim, sweet daughter Penelope, Lorna Heilbronn. She tells him that they're financially in the shit and she's had to economise and let some of the servants go. Manny reassures her that what he has found on his jaunt will win him the famed Richter Prize, complete with a 10,000 quid bounty, and thus put them back on Easy Street. So what's he found? Well, it's a bloody big humanoid skeleton with a massive skull. It's centuries older than previous finds, yet belongs to a race that was physically and mentally more advanced. And anomaly, it throws all previous beliefs about human evolution into a right old spin, so it does. Penelope doesn't exactly wet her bloomers with joy and relief, but Manny is extremely enthusiastic and insistent. At breakfast, Manny takes delivery of a letter from his half-brother James, Christopher Lee. James is the director of a secure mental hospital. The letter informs of the recent death of Manny's wife Marguerite. Jenny Runacre. Seems Manny had her committed when Penelope was an infant and conveniently forgot to tell her about it, giving her the impression she was dead. There's a bit of rivalry between Manny and James. James has taken care of Marguerite's funeral and informs Manny that he will no longer be subsidizing any of his trips abroad or subsequent research work. He's written some gibberish tome on how to mistreat and brutalize the mentally ill and dress it up as therapy, which he intends to enter for the famed Richter Prize. It's a prevalent theme in the psychiatry of yore that continues to this very day. Setting out to clean the skeleton in his lab, Manny wets a bony index finger and it grows flesh and a nail. He hacks the finger off with a chisel and puts it in a jar of preservative. Then, assisted by his colleague, Professor Waterlow George Benson, sets about analysing the blood and tissue of the finger. After referring to his textbooks about New Guinea tribal folklore and observing the activity of the blood through a microscope, Manny concludes that it incubates the chemical essence of evil. From the blood, he develops a serum that he believes will inoculate the recipient against catching evil. An early COVID jab. He injects a shitload into a lab monkey and afterwards, although the monkey looks largely fucked to me, declares the experiment a success. Penelope has unanswered questions about her mother. Her room has been locked since her apparent death and Manny has kept it sealed and off limits. Curiosity gets the better of her, so she borrows her father's key and pops in for a look around. She makes several discoveries. Her mother was a famously risque music hall dancer. In a newspaper article, she reads how her mother was committed to an asylum. She also finds a letter informing of her mother's recent death. In response to these revelations, she dresses in her mother's clothes and plays her piano, which attracts Manny's attention, who at first thinks Marguerite has returned from the dead. Not a very rational first thought for a man of science. Father and daughter have a bit of a row. We see in flashback Marguerite's decline from vivacious dancer into a depraved, dissolute, alcoholic nymphomaniac, and her complete mental collapse, resulting in compulsory lifelong admission to the Christopher Lee Cracker Factory. Manny has always feared Penelope will have inherited hereditary mental health problems from Marguerite. He decides to help her out with a kindly jab of anti-evil serum, which it turns out wasn't the brightest of moves, you don't say, as evidenced by the monkey going apeshit bananas, busting out of its cage, trashing the lab, and collapsing in a twitching deranged heap on the floor. Oops. Penelope goes missing, and she's not the only one. Hulking homicidal half-wit Charles Lenny, Kenneth J. Warren, has absconded from Brother James' not all that secure mental health facility. Lenny washes up in London where he busts up a bar and brothel after trying to throttle a prostitute. He's a one. As Manny, assuming the worst, frantically searches the less savoury quarters of London for his errant daughter, she's dressed up in her mother's clothes and is out to enjoy herself. She lands at the same bar and brothel as Lenny, which has been remarkably well reconstructed after his demolition job the previous night. Downing big shots of gin and dancing lasciviously, she gravitates from clawing the face of a rather sexually persistent young toff to slashing open the throat of a molesting sailor with a broken bottle. On the run from the locals and the law, Penelope happens across the same warehouse where Lenny is hiding out. Sensing a kindred spirit, another insane nut bar, Lenny sympathetically tries to help her escape. She repays his kindness by deliberately causing him to fall from the upper floor to his death. The law apprehends her and delivers her to James at his asylum. James recognizes his niece, and an analysis of a sample of her blood arouses his suspicion that someone has done something untoward to the girl. Returning Penelope home, a visit to Manny's lab confirms that his brother is guilty of experimenting on his own daughter. James suggests that he and Manny collaborate on a submission for the Richter Prize, for which James will naturally take most of the credit. Otherwise, James will go public and ruin his brother's reputation. What an all-out cunt a cad. Deciding to hijack Manny's discoveries completely, James employs thuggish thief Carl Morris Bush to help him steal the skeleton. Carl burgles Manny's lab, beating Waterlow to death in the process. He secures the skeleton and carries it to where James is waiting in a coach. It starts to rain heavily. This does not bode well. As Carl and James make their escape, Manny gives chase on horseback. The coach crashes, trapping Carl. James goes to fetch help, but rain is pouring onto the skeleton and causing flesh to foam on the bones. By the time Manny gets there, Carl skull has been torn apart and the skeleton is missing. Manny glimpses a towering cloaked figure in the trees and beats a path for home. Sedated in bed and supervised by a dozy maid, Penelope appears to be asleep. The maid drops off and Penelope, who hasn't been quite sedated enough, awakens and strangles her to death. Downstairs, Manny is cowering fearfully after burning the severed and now twitching finger on the fire. There comes a pounding on the front door. Only a raving mad idiot would open it. Enter Penelope, who does just that, allowing access to the reanimated evil one. The creature confronts Manny in Marguerite's room and advances upon him. Manny demands to know what the creature wants. It holds up its hand with a missing finger. There is a crunching sound and a scream. James arrives with staff from the asylum. Penelope is dancing a jig on the lawn in her nightie. He finds Manny sobbing, gibbering and quite insane in the room of his dead wife. And we're back to the beginning. Manny's white wall laboratory is revealed to be a cell in James's asylum, where he is an inmate. The young medic, a visiting physician, consults with James, agreeing that Manny is quite insane and completely delusional. Why, he even believes that James is his half-brother, and the violently crazy young harridan in the cell next door is his daughter. Notions James dismisses as the utterly ludicrous concoctions of a diseased mind. He claims no familial connection with the man who was coincidentally admitted 3 years ago, just before James won the coveted Richter Prize. The final scene closes with Manny stood at the bars of his cell, pleading for someone to believe in and help him, and a close-up of his hand, which is missing an index finger. It's a bizarre and incongruous little gothic shocker that is both engaging and amusing. What helps are the performances of the two lead actors. Lee and especially Cushing demonstrate remarkable talents for making the gibberish they speak seem completely plausible. So good are they at indulging and investing in the pretense that they believe it, then so should you. It doesn't matter that you know it's utter baloney. Cushing could tell me the world is flat, and on some atomic level I'd be thinking, well, you know, he might have a point. And it's always good to see Lee in a straight-up villain role. He was a very, very good bad guy, something I don't need to tell most of you. The creeping flesh intrigues because it does dare to be a little bit different. The monster is something out of the ordinary, a big, eerie skeleton that grows flesh. But in this film, he's not the main monstrosity on show. These are clearly of the more human variety. Lee's James is a self-serving narcissist who cares for no one save himself. He has no real interest in the patient locked up in his asylum. They are a means to an end. Research subject, lab rats. He wants to further his career and status by any means necessary, and if that involves torture, murder, theft, blackmail, then so be it. His only concern regarding the escaped Lenny is the adverse impact it might have on his institution, and thus himself. When the police inspector tells him it might not be possible to bring Lenny back alive, James' response is,
"Just bring him back, Inspector."
He methodically shoots in the back 3 times a patient who's taken possession of the keys and attempts to free others. Just like putting down a troublesome animal. He's a bit hardcore, is James. Manny is a paternal but ultimately misguided monster. He believes he knows what's best for his daughter and that by lying to her about her mother, he is protecting her. In fact, he's just sowing the seeds of her destruction and watering the fuckers to bloom in the spring. Recklessly injecting her with a serum he's only just slapped into a lab monkey is an act of pure patriarchal madness. It does, however, give rise to the funniest scene in the film. On discovering the lab monkey's adverse reaction to the injection, the trashed laboratory, and the animal's convulsing near-dead carcass, Waterloo exclaims in heartfelt relief,
"Thank God we didn't use it on a human being."
The expression on Cushing's face is absolutely priceless. One of the greatest "oh fuck" moments you'll ever see. The most powerful and compelling characters on show, however, are the women. Granted, Jenny Runacre is on screen only briefly, but her Marguerite montage is a heady slideshow of a personality in violent disintegration. A woman who is clearly unwell and is exploited by men for their own gratification. When she loses the plot, she gets hauled off to a Victorian asylum on the say-so of her husband. In brief moments of screen time, Runacre without dialogue communicates a persuasive combination of hysteria, confusion and howling despair. Lorna Heilbronn may not be the best actress in the world, but she handles the transition from poised and graceful Jane Austen-flavoured virgin to raving mad scarlet-clad promiscuous murderess on the run with pleasing conviction. Her plight is even more dictated by imposed male dominance in a male-dominated society. Her father makes all the decisions that drive her into insanity. She has no agency, no voice, no say. This was a time in which little was understood of the female condition, and the patriarchy called the shots. No comprehension of biopsychological phenomena such as early menopause, postnatal depression and psychosis, anxiety states and the like. A so-called moral lapse such as getting pregnant out of wedlock was often enough to buy a girl a one-way ticket to Bedlam. Now, although The Creeping Flesh could hardly be considered a feminist tract or an in-depth critique of Victorian patriarchy, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that submerged in there somewhere are some sketchy social implications about the suppression and mistreatment of women in Victorian England. Wrapped up in some quite lovely sepia-toned cinematography, authentic-looking period set design, and a catchy, often minimalist score by Paul Ferris, The Creeping Flesh is good-looking and thick with atmosphere. Freddie Francis directs with a steady hand, with lots of medium and long shots, lens distortion to convey advancing insanity, and a few point-of-view takes from the inside of the monster's bleeding, fleshy skull. The cast go out of their way to act it like they mean it, which always helps in this sort of farrago. Then there's the inconclusive ending. Is Manny's story the truth, or is it an elaborate delusional construct, a fabrication in the mind of a hopeless psychotic? What do you reckon? I reckon it's a rather cool little mind teaser to finish on. I wouldn't cite it as a genre classic, and personally, the film it was supporting when I first saw it, and now the screaming starts, was the one I slightly preferred. Well, it had Stephanie Beacham and her chest in it. Yes, I am that shallow. Only I haven't seen that one for ages and don't currently have access to a suitable copy for review purposes. Then I remembered a couple of people had requested The Creeping Flesh, and occasionally I like to keep that customer satisfied, or at least try to pay lip service. Well, what else do you expect? Overall, it's pretty much my sort of thing, and I like it a good deal, which usually means that most will fall into the opposite camp. Still, if your headspace accommodates the same sort of junk as mine, you'll like it too, and no mistake. Thank you, I'm grateful as always for your time and attention. Do whatever you want to do next. Hit like, don't like, comment, subscribe, be a patron of my Patreon thing, make a financial contribution via the thanks button. Whatever you choose is fine by me. I'll be back in the fullness of time. Until then, you take good care, pilgrims.